Welcome, peace upon you. I am Qadi Tayyib, and this is Qur'anomics. And this is part two from the series of From Islam of the Quran to the Islam of the Hadith, Imam Al-Shafi'i, the true founder of traditional Sunni Islam religion. Now, it is titled Corrupting the Word Wisdom to Become Sunnah. This is how he did it. Among the mistakes of Al-Shafi'i is that he was a poet. And poets have four fatal mistakes. Any poet: filling, imagination, tandem, and lying. Filling is, instead of one line of poetry, he will say five or six or 10 just to get to one line as to build in the hype. Imagination, he'll use his imagination. We all know imagination. I'll fly to the moon. I'll love you till the end, till death. Imagination. Tandem, they do not differentiate between words. Let's say between father and dad. Even though they're two separate, they're in the same category, but they're two separate positions. So that's for an example. And lying. We all know poets just love to lie. Just saying lies and lies, but in an imaginary and filling way that makes you just that takes you out of this world. And also, the fifth is taking and leaving what is appropriate for a subject. So they might focus on one thing and then not focus on the others. Just focus on the positive and leave the negatives, or focus on the negatives and just leave the positive. So the entry of Al Shafi'i and his weak argument is everything that the messenger of God enacted that is not in a book, and what he wrote in this book of ours, Imam Al-Shafi'i's book, from mentioning what God has given to the servants of learning the book and wisdom, is evidence that wisdom is the Sunnah of the Messenger of God, page 32 from his first book, The Message. And with this unexpected shock and synonymy in wording and meaning, and a confusion between wisdom and the Sunnah, and it is an argument that will not have the power to convince unless it is derived from the Book of God. So he singled out a statement for it called Explanations of God's Obligation in his book to follow the Sunnah of his messenger. He mentions 7 verses, and he deliberately picked these 7 verses because these verses were directed to Prophet Muhammad. And I'll give you the chapter and the verse. The cow, 129. The cow, 151. Chapter Al Imran, verse 164. Friday, 2. Cow, 231. Women, 113. Parties, 34. And Al Shafi'i continues, because the Quran was mentioned and followed by wisdom, and God mentioned it to his creation by teaching the book and wisdom, so he did not find, and God knows best, to say wisdom here except the Sunnah of the Messenger of God. So we cannot mistake that Al-Shafi'i, the author of the book, The Message, who insisted in advance on the synonym between two words, wisdom and the Sunnah, twisting one to fit into the other, sees his argument that the Quran verses came 7 times in conjunction with wisdom that can only be the alleged Sunnah. And from that position, because when we're talking about when you exalting a person or the personality of the Prophet, and one says, Imam Shafi'i says, well, the wisdom is the Sunnah of the Prophet, no one dares to say no, because we're talking about the Prophet, and the Prophet is the highest example, highest personality back then. So no one would dare to say, to belittle the Prophet or take anything away from him. So he used that, the fear of being exiled from society or judged in a negative way because you or anyone dared to take away something from the prophet, because everything positive has to be given to the prophet because he was the perfect person. He was the messenger. So you can't just, if someone says, well, the word, the wisdom is the sunnah, then who's there to argue? And we notice the other synonymy where he mixed between the book and the Quran as being one. And this is not logical, as the Quran is not necessarily the book, and as the Quran is not necessarily the book, but the Quran is part of the book. We note that Al-Shafi'i deliberately did not mention the rest of the other 24 verses that contain the word wisdom because he was cherry picking, and there are 8 other verses that Al-Shafi'i deliberately did not list because they include the rest of the prophets and non-prophets like Luqman al-Hakim, Idris, and so on and so on. So here's some other verses, the other verses that Al-Shafi'i did not mention, even though they had the word wisdom, because the word wisdom in the Quran, if you read it, it means wisdom. Someone wise, or wise people, or people that use judgment in the right way. So here are, let's say, chapter Al Imran, verse 48. Wisdom is a distraction back to Jesus. Table 110, addressed to Jesus. Al Imran 79, meaning Jesus. Al Imran 81, people of Jesus. Woman 54, Al Ibrahim, the family of Ibrahim. Jathia 16, children of Israel. The cattle 89, the people of Abraham, and the people of all the prophets, including Muhammad and his people. So, although Shafi'i emphasized the Arabic of the Quran and that only Arabs could understand it, he was the first to break this rule by establishing his foolishness, ignoring that if the structure changed, the meaning would change also. And his ignorance that the Quran's tongue is free of synonyms and that God is more accurate than what he imagined in his creation and speech. The Shafi'i here forcibly reconstructed the concept of religion, linking the absolute book of God to what is relative human, and transferring the source of religion from the book of God to the so called Sunnah, the person of the messenger, and the jurist leading it on behalf of the messenger. There is nothing in the Arabic tongue or any dictionary that indicates that wisdom is the Sunnah or vice versa. And if we were to call the wisdom or call on something, if we were to call wisdom on something, it is the book of God because it is its home and he is the wise. And wisdom, in the language of the Arab, wisdom is about knowing the best of things with the best of sciences, and quantity and wisdom are among the best of scientists. And wisdom also knowledge and jurisprudence and justice. And Al Hakim, the scholar and the possessor of wisdom, or the person that judges, is always correct. So we can see that this is just one word. We're not talking about other words. And later on, we get into how he chopped the verses into sentence and then pick one word and twist it the same way. So this is what the Shafi'i did. His game was to play on words, to play on words, and just to be. He started off basically from the position of the prophet, that he's the high example, and giving him his dues or more than his dues, and we will find out how this is not possible. That the Sunnah that belongs to just one person, like we said, the Sunnah belongs to everybody. It's a way of life. It's a way God intended for people to be. But the Sunnah is not going to come down. The way of life is not going to come down to earth from God just like that as a gift, as a basket. It has to be created by people. And so people created this Sunnah, invent and come up with new things. And that's how we have traditions and cultures. In every society, we have traditions, cultures, and way to do things. And this is part of the Sunnah, which is the way of life. So we're not denying the word Sunnah, but we're denying or we're arguing how it is used. So if the Prophet is doing this is the source of the Sunnah, so what was the people before the Prophet doing? How were they living? From Prophet Muhammad all and go all the way back to Noah to Adam. How were they living without a Sunnah of life? How was their life? A mess. So it doesn't make any sense that the Sunnah of life or the Sunnah of the Prophet, because we will find out later on that everything in life, everything in life has to be traced back to the Prophet. So the question is, what about before the Prophet? How was their life? And this is what we'll find that this is our argument, and more than this. This is just one little point. So I am Qadi Tayyib, and this is Quranomics. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again.